Hi everyone, in the last video we talked about 2A in the 2019 ACJC Prelims Micro Essay section. Now in this video we look at 2B, discuss whether market liberalization is always the solution to misallocation of resources caused by a monopolistic firm. If you know me, I like to break down the questions into 3Cs, the command word, the concepts related to this question, and the context, and I will do the same. So for the command word in this case, it is discuss whether, and the key question is whether it's always the solution. So if we understand this command word, it helps us to think about what our thesis and antithesis statements and arguments are going to be right from the beginning when we read the question. So in this case, if we read the question, our command is telling us that market liberalization is a good solution, right? So in this first argument, we have to talk about all the strengths of market liberalization. And the antithesis in this case is the argument that it is not always. So they use the term always the solution. So our counter argument has to be not always the solution and not about other policies. So the antithesis, I say again, is not about policies, but is arguing how it is not always the solution. So perhaps you could be talking about some limitations about market liberalization or some nuances on why it may not or there's some difficulties in reaching that solution of allocation of resources. So that is the command word, right? It gives you the argument and the counter argument that you need to write about. The key concepts, right, tell you what economic analysis they want. So in this case, the key concepts are both market liberalization and misallocation of resources. So the A-level students would need to understand what misallocation of resources mean, right? And in economics, we know that misallocation of resources could refer to three different types of misallocations. It could be allocative inefficiency, productive inefficiency, and a firm which is not dynamic efficient. And all these related to things like price, cost, and the quality of the product. So I guess the question is making you think about how this policy helps firms to be more efficient for the sake of society or consumers' welfare. Okay. We also need to know that one concept is the market liberalization, that it is a government policy, and this government policy has to do with the overarching theme of relaxing regulations and encouraging greater competition. So if the student did not understand what market liberalization is, it will be impossible to do this question. So you need to show the examiner that you understand it is about greater competition and encouraging that from the government. Lastly, the context, right? And we read the last part of the question, caused by a monopolistic firm. So we can unpack this context first of what it means to be a monopoly, right? And if we understand the characteristics and the features of a monopolistic firm, we will know that monopolistic firms have strong market power, they have strong ability to set prices, and they have a high profit margin. So you need to find a way on how this context causes this misallocation of resources that we have talked about. So very quickly, right? Strong market power enables it to exploit the consumer surplus of consumers, right? The ability to set prices high, right? It makes goods and services very expensive for consumers, and consumers may not be able to enjoy different types of products because of the barriers to entry, right? So we need to find a way to link this context on how it causes misallocation of resources before we can then talk about how market liberalization helps to be that solution. So these are the 3Cs, and it's supposed to help you frame your essay even before you start. But I'd like to do one more step, right? And that is looking at some of the criteria that we could use in making a reasoned judgment on how it is always or whether it's always the solution. What are some nuances in the argument we can consider even before we start writing. I think that will be helpful because it helps you to have the end in mind so that when we start writing, we do not get stuck halfway. So if we understand our market structure concepts well, we would know, right, that there are some key criteria for evaluation. Firstly, whether it's a solution or not, we can think of how it is dependent of the type of industry in question. And one key question is there a high fixed cost in this market, right? Is there a high fixed cost such that having many firms would be a problem, right? For this particular industry, right? Would there be wastage of resources? Would the firm be even able to survive if there's too much competition, right? And we can think of some examples like electricity generation, the water supply market, right? When there are such high fixed costs, sometimes market competition may not be the best thing. So are you able to pick up, right, that whether or not it's the solution, it depends on the industry. We can also see another criteria for evaluation. Is there an incentive for the firm to continue improving its efficiency, right? Maybe it's not about just more competition. Maybe there could be other nuances to the argument. Is there threat of competition? So not necessarily we need new firms to enter and compete, but perhaps it is a contestable market, and with always the threat of competition, perhaps that could already improve the allocation of resources. You need not have market liberalization if there is always a constant threat of competition. Or we can also consider another essential question. Is it profitable to innovate? Because if we allow more firms to enter this market and it decreases the profitability of firms, could that also hinder the current firms in the market to innovate and to improve on their processes, improve on the quality of the products, improve on cost-saving methods to bring down prices in the future? So if market liberalization threatens that profitability to innovate, would there still be incentive, right? So I thought I would share these key criteria I had in my mind before I started this essay, and it would be helpful so that we don't get stuck halfway and we have many evaluation points as we write. So those are the 3 C's: the command, the concepts, and the context. And if I may add one more, right? The key criteria, that's the 4th C that we can think of before we start writing. So how will we structure our essay then, right? After we have broken down the question. I think in our A levels, we also need to think about how we are going to paragraph our entire essay. So let me give us an example. So firstly, of course, in every Part B question, we need an introduction. And again, I would say that the introduction is to show the examiner, right, that you understand the context. Show that the examiner that you know there are certain key concepts that are going to be tested. And show the examiner that you know what this whole question is talking about. So in this question, I think it's first most important to explain the features of the monopoly, because this is the context that was given to us. So you want to explain how a monopoly has high market power. They are price setters, and what we have assumed in this question is that they have high profit, and this is usually at the expense of consumer welfare. So bring in some of these terms to show your understanding of monopoly with an economic perspective. Then after that, we want to explain the context, right, of this question, which would mean unpacking inefficiencies in monopoly. So you show the examiner that you understand that inefficiencies relate to allocative and productive inefficiency, or it could also mean that the firm is not dynamically efficient, right? That means they do not constantly innovate and improve on their processes and their products. And lastly, the policy in question is market liberalization. So perhaps you want to give an overview about what market liberalization is, which is the opening up of the market to greater competition. And perhaps you can give a few examples of these policies like deregulation policies, right, to show that understanding of the theory behind that. And then in our second paragraph, we are going to have the thesis, right? And in this main thesis, our argument should center about how market liberalization reduces the misallocation of resources, right? So you must explain how it does, right? Because that's the question. It's not just a yes, no, but if yes, how? And if no, why not, right? So this now we're doing the yes and how. So in this section, how does market liberalization reduces misallocation of resources? What are you going to do in this paragraph? Right, firstly, right, you want to explain how more competition causes the price of the good or service to decrease, right? Because we said that monopoly, they may not be allocatively efficient. They may set prices higher than compared to the P equals MC price, right? And that exploits the consumer surplus. So bring some of these concepts in, right? Explain how more competition increases the number of firms, hence increases the supply. Explain how it introduces more substitutes into the market, causing the demand to be more price elastic. It affects the ability to set prices. It reduces market share. So all these key concepts, as you explain how that reduces the price, right, and improves allocative efficiency. And I think a good way to show that you are thorough in your analysis is also to draw a diagram to aid your explanation. So that's the first part, right? Explaining how more competition causes price to decrease and being more allocative efficient. We can also explain how more competition incentivizes the firms to be more cost efficient. So in this part, you can explain how introducing more firms causes the current firms to consider how to be more profitable by lowering their costs, right? Because if their revenue is being threatened, they are incentivized to improve profits through another strategy, right? And to improve on their production methods to be more cost efficient, right? So in that case, you are explaining how it improves productive efficiency. Or thirdly, right, you can explain how more competition incentivizes the firm to be dynamically efficient, right? And you can explain how they can adopt non-price strategies. They can improve on their products, innovate in order to compete better, not just by price, but by the quality of their products or the types of products and the different variations of the products that they can produce. And that all helps in the consumer welfare. And we can link that to dynamic efficiency. And for point 2 and 3, right, as you are explaining this, don't only explain it in terms of theory, explain it how you can use different examples of different markets to elaborate on your analysis. Maybe you can bring in things like the public transport market. Maybe you can bring in industries like the electricity market, or whichever market you feel comfortable, which helps you substantiate your point. Bring those examples in. And lastly, for our thesis, perhaps there is also one more benefit, right, of having market liberalization policies. For example, there could be other positive unintended consequences in specific industries. For example, with more competition, right, firms need to be more innovative to find out new solutions. For example, clean energy, right? Or, for example, how more competition allows things like the public transport to be improved, and improving on the service helps to also reduce the reliance on private transport, right? So with more affordable transport service, may perhaps in the positive unintended consequence could be to reduce congestion and improve the environment, right? However, I must say that these examples are very industry specific and they should not be your main argument, right? It's a kind of by the way thing, added points and evaluation, which may not be necessary if you don't have time. Okay, so far I've talked about the thesis and how market liberalization reduces different types of misallocation of resources, right? And I've shared with you some key concepts that you should be elaborating on in this essay. So then we should move out to our antithesis about how market liberalization does not always reduce misallocation. Again, I repeat, it's not about bringing other policies that reduce the misallocation, but it's about arguing why it's not always going to reduce misallocation, right? If we go according to how the question is asked. So I would say that there are two main reasons why it does not always reduce misallocation. I think the first one is due to industry specific needs. For example, right, certain industries have very high fixed costs, right, and they need to maintain that size and market share for it to be efficient. So, for example, the water supply market in Singapore, right? The fixed costs are very high because they need to lay the infrastructure, the piping, right? And need to ensure that the water is clean and sent out to the different homes, right? So with those high fixed costs, the economies of scale are really high, right? And the marginal efficiency um, marginal efficiency scale is also very high, such that such industries, firms need a large market share for it to be even surviving, right? So having more competition may actually detract from the objective of improving consumer welfare. So you want in this paragraph share on how certain industries do not benefit from market liberalization, right? Because of such key concepts related to cost and the need for only one or two firms, fewer firms the better for such industries. Or we could also talk about how some industries may be hindered in increasing their innovation with more competition. So the idea here is that with more competition, there are now lower profits, right? And with lower profits, firms do not have that sort of funding anymore, right? To have good research and development to produce new products, innovative products, better quality products, right? And end up with that little profit. All they do in differentiating themselves is through advertisement, through marketing strategies, which need not necessarily benefit the consumer welfare. It may not be dynamically efficient anymore, right? But here is where we need to start arguing, right, about more competition is good, but maybe not so much, right? And having a balanced viewpoint. So this first type of counter argument, right, is explaining how it does not reduce misallocation of resources because certain industries just do not benefit from that. And we have talked about the first 2 points. But the second kind of antithesis could be also related to the limitations of the policy, right? Maybe because market liberalization does not always reduce misallocation, because the policies that the government implement may have some limitations on how it reduces misallocation. Let me give you an example. For example, in certain industries, current incumbent firms have such high barriers to entry that even if I introduce new firms, I deregulate the industry, this new competition may not make a substantial impact to see improvement in efficiency levels, right? For example, there could be contrived barriers, such as predatory pricing, right? Even though the government does something, competition does not improve because of incumbent firms' predatory pricing. Or perhaps because consumers are already loyal to one particular brand and the increased competition may not necessarily improve the efficiency, right? I can think of one example. For example, in the retailing of electricity to households, right? In the initial stages, right, many consumers were loyal to Singapore Powers, right? And even with more competition, they were not necessarily there were lower prices that consumers were enjoying, right? Because maybe they were so loyal, they were concerned with the new brand, were they able to provide stable electricity? And it took some time, right, for the government to say, hey, you know what, on top of just making it more competitive, I need to provide some information, right, that even other firms can provide electricity safely and efficiently to you, right? Then only after other supplemental policies did the competition start to thrive like now, like what we see now, and then we can see the benefits of that market liberalization. So this second section of our counter argument is how it does not always reduce misallocation, not because of the industry, but because maybe certain market liberalization policies in itself, it has some difficulty in fostering the environment of competition and limiting that positive impact. So I've just gone through the argument, which is our thesis on how it reduces misallocation of resources and how it doesn't. Right. So after we have our balance argument, we have talked about a breadth of points, right? So many points. We have given our points in depth, right? Which is using economic analysis. That's why I feature all the key concepts in this essay and these paragraphs, right? So after we have those breadth and depth with good examples, that will help us reach our L3. But more importantly, we have 5 marks of evaluation. And how do we get those evaluation marks, right? On top of the different evaluation points that you pepper throughout your essay, you have to make a reasoned judgment in your synthesis, which is in your conclusion. So what are some angles our synthesis can take? So firstly, in your conclusion, perhaps what you could do is to emphasize again the importance of competition as a whole, right? This whole essay is about how liberalization of the market has a lot more competition, and that is beneficial with a few key ideas, right? So reiterate how those points help to reach the government's objective, and then bring back the argument and show the bigger picture, right? But at the end of the day, right, there are some nuances in the argument, right? It's not only about whether it's liberalizing the market or not. There are other key factors to consider, right? What type of industry are we looking at? What um, what other limitations do we face that governments need to consider, right? So you can see some of these criteria that I explained in the previous slide. And lastly, in your synthesis, you can also provide further suggestions. What are some other things the government can do, or perhaps you can give insights on how the government can reach their objectives by making markets more efficient in other ways on top of market liberalization. So perhaps only in this last section, you can suggest maybe a few other supporting policies that may aid in this government's objective, right? So you don't bring these policies in your arguments, but you talk about how in the bigger picture, it cannot work alone, right? Market liberalization is not one policy, right? It needs to be supported by other features of government's policies, right? So that shows the maturity of thought and considering in the bigger picture of economics, um, how governments can reach their micro objectives in market. So I hope the breaking down of the question and showing you a structure on how the essay can be answered is helpful to you. If you find it difficult to use economic analysis in any of these points, then perhaps what you need to do is to revise these key concepts and how they're related to competition. Thank you very much and have a great day ahead.